Hello, and happy Sunday to everyone out there. This week, we're going to talk about the attention trap. And that is the idea that our modern economy is built around industry in particular, gaining our attention. It's one of the most valuable resources today. And there are some pitfalls that come along with that. And so I thought we'd examine the attention trap, so the attention economy, how it kind of came into being, how we've used psychology to target and really manipulate people's psychology to be better consumers, and what the implications of that has been, both in terms of the economy, but then our mental health and our success as human beings. We're going to talk a little bit about ad tech and how the rise of advertising technology has created some really perverse incentives in today's environment that are causing disruption not only to ourselves as individuals, but also to our economy and our society. And then we're going to wrap up with some ideas on how we might change our behaviors and adapt to this information environment to be more successful as people. So to start, I want to do a little bit of history. So rumor and gossip, right, were always bits of information that were valuable because it helped us figure out who was trustworthy in an environment and who was not. And so when we fast forward to today and we look at social media, there are a lot of evolutionary processes that our brain has developed that are involved in the idea of social media and tracking what everyone else is doing, because it helps us in an evolutionary sense understand where we fit into society. But there are some downsides to that because we're not engaging with people in the village or the tribe construct as we used to. We're looking at what is a curated version of everyone's best lives on social media for the most part. But there are some valuable bits of our brain processes that are in there, but we have to understand how they're affected by the modern economy. And so when we're looking at, and whether it's gossip or rumor or just information, where's the best place to hunt? Where should we move the tribe to? We're always looking to gather that best information. But there are some biases that exist in our minds that are evolutionary shortcuts that help us process information faster and better and not spend as much energy on it. One of those is availability bias, and it's one of the ones that I think affects us most in the modern world. And that's the idea that the information we hear most often is more likely to be believed as true, right? So if we heard, thousands and thousands of years ago that this particular area by this cave and waterfall was a great place to hunt or fish or gather food, and we heard it from multiple people, well, we would probably believe it to be true because we're triangulating what we think truth is based on different information input. In today's information environment, though, and we'll get into why these incentives are in place, there are a lot of incentives to spread information that's simply inflammatory, right? Whatever gets people's attention best. There's a great saying in the media, and particularly the newspaper industry, called "if it bleeds, it leads." That means things like conflict, destruction, the unusual, and things that are threatening tend to be stories that people are going to read most often. Now, that makes sense. Another bias that we have as humans is called negativity bias. And that means that it's easier for us to pay attention to things that are negative. Now, if you think about it in the evolutionary sense, that does make sense, right? We want to know where the threats are. We want to know what information is out there that can harm us. So we have this idea in our brains that we're programmed to see things that are negative. Well, in today's environment, the depth of things which are negative is endless. And so when we look at the information that's out there, the things that are both available and the things that our brains are most likely to pay attention to are things that are negative, things that are disruptive, things that are dragging people down, whether it's ideas or painting people you disagree with as the enemy. And it's so easy to find that information that even if it's not true, you are more likely to believe it because it is both available and it tends to be negative. Now, like I said, newspaper headlines, they were really always designed to grab your attention, even if they were misleading. Now, there are some ethical standards in the media industry where they're not supposed to lie, right? And there are repercussions to credibility over time. They have to print retractions, which were expensive in the old days, where you actually had to reprint the paper or print a new version of a story. One thing that's interesting to note is that headlines aren't picked by writers, they're actually picked by the editors. And the writers oftentimes are battling with the editors to pick headlines that are both eye-catching, but also more true. And unfortunately, we've devolved into a world where pretty much all we read are headlines because they are so quickly available. We don't have to dig into them much. Now, some other ideas that serves the background for this conversation today are some theories related to how information flows. So one of those is called agenda setting theory. And this is a criticism I've heard from people in why they don't trust mainstream media. So agenda setting theory is just the idea of what media chooses to cover affects your availability bias, which is true. And historically, when there were a limited number of media, one of the great criticisms was that there was no diversity in the information. They all covered kind of the same thing, particularly on the television news channels. Now, throughout history, especially throughout US history, but really around the world, there's always been the case that news has been politicized. Different political parties have actually owned different newspapers at different times. And so there's always been aspects of political bias or favoritism in these sources. But in today's environment, it's even more pronounced. Like I said, when there's this bias built in there and media are trying to set a specific agenda, so when you look at particularly CNN and Fox News is a proclaimed conservative site and was developed particularly for the purpose of being a conservative propaganda news source. And now the other news sources have taken the flip side. So they basically followed Fox News's example and became the same for more progressive ideas. And that's problematic because it does undermine media credibility and it does undermine people's belief in those systems. And the reason they've done that is because they've seen it as a necessary evil due to the need for profitability, ratings, advertising when it comes to newspapers, and a lot of other outlets. They're funded primarily by advertisement. Subscription tends to not cover all of that. And we, I think, have now developed a sense of entitlement where we think news and information should be free, even though it is expensive to produce. So it's a little bit on media. Another of the biases that affect us when it comes to the information environment and the attention economy is confirmation bias, right? It's this increased belief in information that confirms our existing beliefs, right? So if I think we should institute a flat tax, for example, a sales tax, I'm going to seek out and believe information that confirms the thing that I already believe, particularly if it's something that involves my identity, whether it's religion, race, economy, social standing, class. I'm going to look for information that I find confirms what I already believe. Now, so confirmation bias and going into echo chambers, which is something that we talk about frequently today, is harder to do when news sources are shared and broad, as they used to be when there were only a few of them, because there were only a few that can maintain profitability. But as it is easier to be profitable due to advertising technology, it is then also easier to find your own echo chamber and be comfortable in it to confirm your own biases. We'll get into that more in a little bit. One of the other biases that affects us is called the framing effect, and that is how information is offered to us, packaged, if you will, framed, is alters our perception of its believability. So some of those things are, for instance, you can always find an expert on whatever it is you're looking for. So it's a little bit of confirmation bias, but having the information presented to you in a way that seems legitimate, right? So if you find a doctor that says something crazy, well, there's still a doctor and there's a level of credibility that goes along with that. And so because it's packaged in that way, and because the information environment makes it easier, there's a lower point of entry, anybody with any crazy idea can get out there and monetize that crazy idea. And that's one of the challenges we face. Now, historically, there have always been challenges. So one was the fairness doctrine, where for years, decades even, there was this mandate that if you shared one political opinion, you had to find someone of the opposing political opinion to provide fairness or balance. Now, it was never really entirely fair because on one hand, you could find a really weak candidate to propose the counter idea and do a bad job of it. But also some ideas didn't have a really solid counter, right? So if we think about, for instance, climate change, right? After climate change was much more established science and you could measure the evidence that the globe is warming and why, presenting an alternative view was seen as giving credibility to something that really wasn't credible. So there are always going to be challenges with demonstrating balance. And we can talk about that. So that was repealed over time. And in today's world, now there's the availability of counter, quote unquote, experts for nearly any topic. So now we're going to talk a little bit about attention itself, stimulation, focus in the reward system that our brain responds to, especially in today's information environment. So I'll share an example from myself. I was playing the game Battlefield 3. So this is a first-person shooter game, and it's a very high-intensity multiplayer game. And I played it, I don't know, for about a month or so. And I found that because it's a game of constant excitement where your adrenaline is up and you're constantly trying to move and detect threats and process the information, it dramatically increases your stress level. And then also, like I said, your adrenaline. So you become, that level of excitement becomes normalized for you. And I found that when I wasn't playing the game, I became more irritable. And then I realized this after about a month or so, that I think it was the game that was causing it. And that was the game and how much I played and all of those things. And when I stopped playing the game, it took I don't know, a week or 2 weeks. And then my brain reset and I noticed I wasn't irritable. This is at least from my personal opinion, and there is some good research on there, this is an interesting finding that there are games out there that are really fun, but also really impactful to our mental health. So we, as humans, have to be careful about what we allow into our information ecosystem. And so that's something that we'll talk a little bit about more. Social media has this effect as well, right? If you've ever read some of the historic studies on rats, right, when they were doing some of the initial testing on response to stimulus, they found that the pattern that rats would hit the bar the most to try and get food was a random pattern. So they wouldn't reward them every time they hit it, and they wouldn't reward them every number of time, because the rats would figure out the pattern and just do that. The one that got them to hit the button the most is when it was a random distribution. And so with social media or loot boxes in games or random rewards when you're playing whatever it is, those things are going to make it where you're going to continue doing that thing over and over. And this is pretty established psychological research. And so things like, Candy Crush and doom scrolling, gambling, those things tend to exploit addictive tendencies and just the tendency of our brain to find rewards, right? Think about this from an evolutionary sense. You didn't always find food that often. So when you found food, it was an exciting thing. Not only that, but if you then ate that food, for instance, berries, you would get a physiological response to that thing. That's the reason, one of the reasons that our brain creates this incentive, because it forces us to continue to seek novelty, because novelty meant survival. In today's world, though, constantly looking for things that are novel increases our desire for that novelty to the point where we have to have increasing levels of stimulus. And so there are things that we can do to counter that we'll talk about, like mindfulness and meditation and taking a break from digital technology, because it is so stimulating that it can dramatically affect ourselves as individuals. And then we'll talk about that, how that affects society as well. So that was a little bit setting the stage for biases, a little bit on the history of the information environment and attention, focus, rewards. So now we're going to get into advertising technology and how it's created today's disinformation economy in particular. So I've labeled this section Google opened Pandora's box. Now, Google is not the only actor that uses advertising technology. Facebook is another massive purveyor of that, but nearly everyone uses it today. Media outlets, people who do podcasts. We don't, disclaimer, we don't actually use, even though we post these on YouTube, we have monetization turned off because I personally don't think it's a great system for the long term of human society and stability, which we'll get to in a minute. Now, I was listening to a Freakonomics podcast, which I'd recommend. I really like their stuff. They dig into some of the ideas. And they had Marissa Mayer on, who was the CEO of Yahoo for a time, but was one of the early employees at Google. And they looked at how they were going to pay for search. And the reason they actually adopted ad tech early on is because it was just a better way to pay for things. It was more scalable. And they wanted to keep the search free, though they had looked at subscription model at one point. And so early on, it wasn't implemented because it was going to make them a lot of money. It was just to support their search function that they were really focused on. But ads now pay for, across the entire information ecosystem, the vast majority of content creation. And a lot of that's really great content, people making how-to videos to fix things, or entertaining videos that we all enjoy. And they're paid out of that just from us paying our time and attention into it. But what is the flip side of that, right? What's the dark side of the ad tech environment? Well, for one thing, there's a ProPublica article that I can link in here that specifically looks into how Google in particular funds disinformation related to COVID and elections during this specific time period. Now, you've got to think about it. It's really hard to police all the people who are doing bad things, even though it's against the terms of service, with advertising technology, right? The huge proliferation of clickbait, and a lot of that clickbait turns into disinformation. And then there are people who are specifically trying to spread disinformation. And that's all, they're all getting paid to do that through the advertising models that Google has, Google, Facebook, others. But the reason I mentioned Google is because they were the first ones to really do this at scale and really made it a viable model. And basically anyone today that's trying to start doing something new that they're trying to get people hooked on because it's free, right? They're going to use advertising, because then they can shift the cost of that onto the advertisers, right, through the collection of your attention, and then get people into their service, whatever it is. So you think about Twitter, Google, Gmail, all of those things, they've now turned into sources of revenue, and they've become really, really targeted because they have become so profitable. And so you think about what this has led to. On YouTube, social media, you have influencers, right? Now, influencers can be something as simple as, kids who come up with cool Lego movies, stop motion Lego movies, or you've got people who do makeup, and then you have people that do anti-vax, flat earthers, conspiracy theorists, people who are really trying to radicalize others into certain ideas. And again, this plays into our availability and confirmation biases. I saw it on the internet, so it must be true. A lot of people joke about that, but that is a real psychological bias. And that's something that's a weakness for us if we're not specifically trying to counter it. And so what this means is that advertising technology has created an incentive system that makes it easier and really promotes the idea of making more extreme headlines and ideas to catch and capture people's attention, because it earns the people who are producing that money. So the bottom line is it makes disinformation profitable, and it's very, very hard to police. So that's a problem. What's the result of that problem when it comes to civil society, and how do we think about it as humanists? So TV, for instance, used to be criticized for crushing dissenting opinion, right? Because there were only 3 channels, and they all kind of said the same thing. And there were dissenting opinions, whether it was on the Vietnam War or civil rights or whatever it happened to be. Now, social media today is actually criticized for the exact opposite, for creating such a polarization of opinion that there's no common ground and understanding, right? Because anyone can find what they're looking for. There's a great comedy skit called "If Google Was a Guy," and I think it's part 3, where there's an anti-vaxxer, and the guy who's playing Google says, it's the query that's put into the Google search is vaccines cause autism. And the guy who's playing Google says, well, I have 1 million results that say it doesn't, and I have 1 result here that says it does. And the actor, who happens to be female in this case, says, I knew it, and takes the 1 result and goes away, right? That's one of the effects of today's information environment. Now, it's not necessarily bad, it just is. It is the result of that, right? The flip side, the good side of that result is that people now have access to a huge amount of information, right? It's really democratized, or at least made available to the masses, the ability to produce and spread content. And a lot of that content is seen as valuable by others, and they get a lot out of it. But that means we also have to account for how the information environment has changed and how our brains haven't, right? Our brains don't evolve nearly as quickly as technology. So we have to account for that and train ourselves through education to be resistant or resilient against it. So additionally, echo chambers, those are more profitable due to the ad tech funding. And that confirmation bias leads to a lack of shared reality. And if we lack shared reality, we can't have logical arguments because we don't share any assumptions, facts, or ground rules, right? We heard former President Trump talk about alternative facts, or actually it was one of his spokespeople talked about alternative facts, right? There are no alternative facts. Facts are the observation of a reality. The interpretation of those can be different, and then the logical arguments you build based on those can be different. But you have to start from a common set of assumptions if you're going to have a civil conversation, right? If we're going to have a debate about what the best way to govern ourselves is, you can't start from completely different assumptions. The sky is blue or the sky is, green, right? Those are not the same thing, right? They're a fundamental misunderstanding of a different position or interpretation. So if we can't do those things, this leads to treating disagreement as evil, that people who don't agree with our position are our enemies versus simply people who are also fellow citizens that have a reasoned dissent. It also leads to things like conspiracy theories, right? Seeing all media as evil and only using what they see as alternate sources. Because all you're doing is digging yourself deeper into that echo chamber, surrounding yourself with no ability to break your confirmation bias, right? Not actively counteracting that. And so we have a fundamental misunderstanding about how real today's world is. Now, there's a quote out there that goes something along the lines of an educated citizenry is necessary for the functioning of democracy. I looked it up. It's not necessarily attributed to anyone in particular, but that's a good idea, right? Because democracy, in my view, is harder than authoritarianism, and the reason it's harder is because citizens share in the power. That means that we have to invest in our citizenry. That's something that we should be really looking at. How do we pay for this, right? Are we going to invest our tax money in our citizenry because they are the foundation of our form of government? Or do we want to transition to an authoritarian government where we simply hope that we have a benevolent tyrant? I think that's probably not a good idea. And history shows that, power really begets tyranny, and they tend not to act as benevolent rulers. And it is better to distribute power as a check and a balance on government systems. So that's the challenge. The information economy is what it is today, right? We could legislate and things would shift around, but all it does is move incentives. So we have to be careful and reasoned about how we adapt to the incentives that are in the system. What breaks, what restrictions, and then what education do we put in place to ensure that we can account for it? So the call to action here, consider in everything that you look at, who benefits from me believing this? I found this question on a checklist for critical thinking a while ago. And to me, it's one of the most powerful questions. And as someone who deals with the media frequently in my day job, this is a very, very effective way to keep from being duped by whatever inflammatory material is trying to get your attention. Ask who benefits from me believing this. And it doesn't matter what the answer actually is, it keeps you skeptical about swallowing something wholesale. Because when something is free, you are the product. Now, I say that to be a little bit inflammatory. There are good debates on whether or not you are the product, or whether you're a willing participant in an exchange of value, time for advertising placement, et cetera. And there's a link I can share on that. And while there's a debate on if you're the product, you are almost certainly the resource, right? And that resource is your attention and your time. Where we spend time and where we give attention is where the economy flows. So realize that if you're not paying for something, someone is benefiting just from you spending time there, just from you spending time on the doom scroll, from hovering over a video, from watching this video. So the question becomes, should we pay for the services? Maybe. Now, the effect of that is it would probably cut down on a significant amount of content creation, right? Unless we create new models where we can more quickly and easily conduct microtransactions where we can pay people 10 cents or 30 cents or $1 for the things that they've created. And there are increasing versions of that, right? My son plays Minecraft, and you can buy packs of that for $5 or $10. And this is content that people in the community have created. And so they're getting paid for what it is they're putting out there, as opposed to being sponsored by advertising. It's a different model. And the problem is, a lot of us are so used to getting things for free, especially depending on which phone ecosystem you grew up on, Android or Apple, that a lot of us don't like the idea of paying $5 for a game that we already own just to get this little bit of extra content. And especially if you're used to getting free, content packages elsewhere. Now, another idea is to pay users for their time and attention, right? Could Google and Facebook actually pay you a portion to serve you ads, right? Could they give you 10 cents for every ad you watch? How would that change incentives over time? Now, people are always going to find loopholes, ways to play, 1,000 videos at once and make a bunch of money. But how would this change the incentives in the system? Would it make it slightly less profitable? So people producing content and the advertisers that are placing their ads are going to be more selective? Maybe. Would this make us like digital miners and farmers? Is this the future of the economy? Right. So there's already survey software out there. One of them is called Mechanical Turk. And it pays people a small amount of money to do surveys. Now that changes the results of the surveys, and people who are conducting them have to be careful about those results because they are paying people versus getting a true random sample. And that really asks the fundamental question I think that underpins that is, how valuable is our time? And are we spending it appropriately? And that's something that we control. And that leads us to my final set of questions, which is, how much value do we get out of these systems? Do we think it's a net positive or negative? Is free Gmail and great search and social media worth disinformation and the slow degradation of our democratic discussion in our country? Maybe, maybe not. Personally, I think I would argue against it. And while I don't have an entirely new system to replace this from the bottom up, one of the things that I've done is started removing myself from the free systems. Right. So I did an experiment a while back to try and de-Google. And I've been relatively successful, but it cost a fair amount of money. Right. Not a lot, but a fair amount, where I had to buy an email service and a cloud hosting service. And I ended up setting up a service of drives where I can put my photos that looks like Google Photos, right? So it's got the nice timeline view, but it's something that they're not scanning all my photos and extracting information from it. Now, this isn't like a conspiracy theory, Google's looking at all my information and selling it to the government, because that's unrealistic and my information is not that interesting to anybody, but they are monetizing it. And personally, I think I would rather pay directly for the things that I value. And this to me is a consistent position in terms of, I would rather pay higher taxes for roads and services. I would rather pay for quality goods that are going to last a period of time that are better for the environment because they're not planned obsolescence. And so the same thing with this information environment, I would offer that we should ask ourselves the question, are we getting value out of this, or do we use it simply because it was already there? And how would we spend our time, our attention, and our resources differently to create a better world? So thanks for joining us for this conversation today. I do hope that you will consider, how is it that you should spend your time? How is it that we should invest as individual citizens, as families, and as communities to then create ourselves a better world? I hope you'll join us again next week. I look forward to having this conversation again after the service. People are welcome to join and have a group conversation. And otherwise, we'll see you again very soon.